Hey everyone, good to see you all. So today I want to talk about the primary radical innovation that Buddhism brought to the Vedic tradition. Of course, when the Buddha arose as a teacher during that time in India, there were many other teachers that were contemporaneous to him. And the one difference that Buddha brought forth, in fact, we all know that the first talk he gave was about the Four Noble Truths and the um, Eightfold Path, but it said that in his second talk, which is uh, it's called the Anatalakana Sutra, is said to be his second talk. He brought forth the doctrine of no self, or non-self as it's sometimes translated, so which was quite different from what the other teachers from the Vedic traditions were talking about. And in a way, this no self or non-self, the nature of the self, is perhaps the primary koan that we all have in any kind of Buddhist practice. What does this mean? No self. I mean, I seem to be here, right? And I don't seem to be the same as Cato or uh, Hakujo. It's I'm who I am, aren't I? So what does he mean by this? And it definitely takes some unpacking to understand. It's part understanding, and of course, like everything in Zen, it's largely experience. But it helps us to have some pointers towards what this uh, non-self could possibly mean. Um, Before I want to go further, I'd like to request that as much as possible in listening to talks in general, we keep zazen mind. I know we're sitting comfortably, and which is marvelous. We get especially during sesshin, it's nice to have a break from sitting in uh, one position. But nonetheless, we can maintain our zazen mind. And working with Shishin Roshi over many years, and I think I must have done my first sessions with him 30 or more years ago. And there have been several occasions, I'm going to share a couple of them, as I think we're going to do this talk in two parts. So part of it may come next time, but at least three times Shishin Roshi said a turning word that really opened something up for me. And if I had not been sitting with zazen mind, I'm not sure that would have happened. So I think we can be comfortably physically at ease, but we should be holding that zazen mind as much as we can during the talks as well, so there's an opening for something to come in, because that's I've got to say, I practiced with Daido Roshi for years, and I had very good practice at the monastery with Daido, but the only teacher I've ever had turning words from that opened something up was from Shishin Roshi, I got to say, and that happened three times definitely. So anyway, that's the way to listen to a Dharma talk, is with that zazen mind. So I want to talk about no self or anatta, and the factor of mind that's most related to it, which I see as dualism or dualistic mind, wants to break the universe into at least two parts, self and other, or me and the universe. And I want to begin by sharing a story about how I first got hooked on the Buddha way, which kind of illustrates this point of dualism. When I was in college back in the 1970s, getting my undergraduate degree, I was in my third year of college, I think. I was 21 years old, and I was living in a group house with some friends, and I was just kind of beginning my investigations into Buddhism. my first big investigation was getting hold of the Beatles' Revolver album, which has a lot to do with consciousness. And in fact, the last song on the record is Tomorrow Never Knows, which begins with lines, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. So the lyrics are all drawn from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And this fascinated me. And also at age 21, I was interested in being cool, of course. And if the Beatles were singing about it, then meditation must be cool. So I got really into Eastern thinking, Eastern experience at that point, and was beginning to investigate it. And in fact, I played that record every day, every single day that whole year, and drove my roommates crazy. And then somebody put me onto, they said, you should read the Dharma Bums. I said, what's that? I said, a book by Jack Kerouac. Probably a lot of you remember that book. It was written in the 1950s, which was when Zen first really started to take hold among artists and intellectuals and the counterculture, particularly in the area around New York, because D.T. Suzuki was giving a series of talks at Columbia University about Zen, and the word got out, and a lot of those folks from the various margins of society, the underground, the artists, etc., started showing up for those talks, because there was something that I think our culture was hungry for in the Ozzy and Harriet 1950s, and which, as prosperous as they were also kind of blank in a certain way culturally. And I think we needed something else, and a certain seed was planted about that time. So Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums came out, I believe, in 1958 or 59, which is pretty early for a book about the Dharma. It's not overall a very deep book about the Dharma, any more than the Beatles' Revolver album was deep as far as Dharma is concerned. But, you know, there was a taste in the pop culture of the times. And one night I was reading the Dharma Bums, and I came to this passage where the Kerouac character, of course, Kerouac's novels were largely autobiographical. So the character who's really Jack Kerouac himself is sitting one night out in a field somewhere and trying to meditate. And he opens his eyes and he sees there's a puddle on the ground, and he sees the stars reflected there. And he spits into the puddle and he sees the stars that are reflected there ripple. And it occurs to him that if those stars that look so real could be rippled by just spitting into the puddle, in other words, they're not real, they're just a reflection, then how do we know the stars overhead are real? And I guess I'd read sci-fi and etc., you know, those kinds of books that speculate about the mind and the universe. And I suppose that somewhere in movies or books, I'd run across the idea that the universe unfolds inside our mind. And I knew the science of that basically the universe is reproduced as though on a screen inside our minds. And it's not necessarily actually the way we see it. It's partly framed by our conditioning. I suppose I'd run across those ideas, but something about it hit me with a power that had never hit me with before. So I was so struck by that I put down the book, and I walked out of my room past my unreal roommates drinking their unreal beers and eating their unreal hamburgers in the unreal dining room. And I walked out into the evening. And I just walked around for a long time looking at the world and just seeing it, just really getting that the way I see it is part, at least in part, in large part, a factor of the way our minds are conditioned, the way all human minds are conditioned, right? I remember walking around and feeling like the whole world was a stage set, like it really wasn't this way. Of course, to some degree, that's true. If I was a bat flying through the same world at the same time and navigating by echolocation rather than by sight, the world would appear completely different, wouldn't it? If you want to experience this for yourself, just go sit outside later today and close your eyes, settle into your zazen, and just listen. And have you ever reflected upon that the world that comes to our ears is the same world that comes to our eyes, but it appears so different to our ears. If our ears were our primary way of navigating the world, how utterly different it would be. There'd be no color, for one thing, and uh, and also the things that we see visually seem so permanent. It can be hard to grasp permanence because every time you go into this group room at Maitreya Abbey, the carpet's in the same place. It sure seems pretty permanent, right? But in the world of sound, a bird song rises and it falls away. The sound of a car rises and falls away. It's the realm of sound is so impermanent and spacious compared to the visual world. In fact, it's a known thing that people who were blind since birth, but then have an operation, there are teams of doctors who go around and do these operations. Some people have congenital cataracts, and it's a relatively easy operation that could be done in the field to remove those cataracts. And so there have been studies done. There's these teams of doctors who've gone all through the Himalayas and with portable means of removing these congenital cataracts. And all of a sudden people can see at ages from childhood all the way to people probably in their 80s, in old age. Suddenly they can see. And it's a well-known thing that people who are suddenly given sight, who are used to navigating just by their ears, they find the realm of sight extremely overwhelming, because their conception of what the universe is like, based upon their hearing and navigating by hearing and by feeling, they have no idea how big and how full the universe looks visually. To them, it seems overwhelmingly cluttered and often really confusing. There are cases where people actually tried to refuse the gift of sight because it was too confusing for them. There are cases of people who learned to walk up and down stairs without sight, and forever after they'd have to keep their eyes closed going up and down stairs because they couldn't process the visual information. They'd trip, so to navigate the stairs they'd have to close their eyes. There was one case I remember hearing of a teenage girl who really wanted to refuse sight because it was so overwhelming, and her parents finally struck this deal where she had to keep her eyes open during school, but when she came home, she could close her eyes and return to the fairly uncluttered and familiar world of blindness. So by choice, she would do that. So the way we see the universe is not necessarily the way the universe is. And the way we see the self isn't the way the self necessarily is. So, and this is something that the Buddha intuited deeply, and it's a basic part of practice, the nature of the self. So following on from this evening where I walked around and saw everything as though it was kind of a stage set, and really, really got that the universe comes in our case as human beings, largely, primarily through our eyes, and then is assembled in our brain in a reasonable way that we can understand. For instance, you probably all know that when visual information comes into the retina, it's upside down. So the brain actually flips over the upside downness so that it matches our other perceptions, so that it's becomes manageable. So at the very least, the world is upside down when it comes into our eyes, and then the brain turns it right side up for us. It does many other things too. It adds space and time and interprets the colors and all sorts of other things. But what is the universe actually before all that interpretation happens? So I was walking around reflecting on this for some days, and this reflection upon some point of the Dharma or of our own perceptions or of our own experience in life, this reflection is actually an important part of practice. And a lot of people overlook it. We need to sit, we need to hear the teachings, and then we need to reflect upon them ourselves and wonder what this means. You know, what does it mean that our perceptions are conditioned and that there's other ways to see things? So I walked around for a few days, and it really seemed to me like, okay, well, the whole universe is unfolding inside my brain, inside my mind. How strange. Quite a paradox, right? It sure seems to be outside. But then I reflected further, and I thought, but wait a minute. Isn't it true that I'm in the universe? So this thing I call my mind is actually in the universe. And there's certainly a universe, there's certainly a world there. I'm not making the whole thing up. There's something happening, even if I'm seeing it perhaps not the way it actually is. So I'd been thinking that the universe was unfolding inside my mind, but actually my mind's unfolding inside the universe. It seemed that way to me for a few days, and then I reflected, but wait a minute, this whole perception that my mind is in the universe, that I'm in the universe, that whole perception is unfolding inside my mind too. So it's back inside. So was it inside or outside? And this is a really good example of the dualistic nature of mind when we're trying to understand something. To me, it kind of boiled down to, am I of the universe? Is the universe outside? Or is the universe inside? Which is it, inside or outside? The rational mind only sees two alternatives, right? But just like with koans often require seeing things from a third perspective, another perspective. The either or won't do, right? So am I inside the universe, or is the universe inside me? It's an either or question, right? It's a false question in a certain way. You might remember Nagarjuna's fourfold negation. So if you apply it to, is the universe outside or inside? Nagarjuna would say, you can't say it's outside. You can't say it's inside. You can't say it's both inside and outside. And you can't say it's neither inside nor outside. That's a version of the fourfold negation. In other words, Nagarjuna is saying, no logical avenue is going to explain this to you. So many of the deeper aspects of life, involve questions that we can't answer. We can't answer, but in Zen, not knowing, of course, is highly valued. Why is this? Well, you might remember the koan that says, not knowing is most intimate. We may not be able to know. I still don't know whether it's inside or outside. It's a pointless question. I'm with Nagarjuna. There's an experience we can have, however, of intimacy with the universe that goes beyond the question of inside or outside, which in a way is a pointless question. Does that make sense? So the dualistic mind wants to say it's inside or it's outside. There's only two alternatives. But the actual reality of it, which we can know intimately, is the question takes us deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. We don't necessarily get a conventional answer, but we experience the intimacy of our lives. It's very similar to questions about love and relationship and the meaning of life. The dualistic aspect of our minds can't answer those questions. In a way, they're pointless questions. Many of us come to practice because we want to know, what is the meaning of life? Why is it all like this? I mean, really, it seems pretty out of control. What's the deal here? And we would love to get a 1 + 1 = 2 answer, but what we actually get is, the deeper we go into the question, the more intimate we feel with our lives. And the beauty and significance of it comes home to us in such a deep way that we can't doubt. We can't doubt the value and worth of our lives. But that doesn't mean we got a question to what the meaning is. A plus B equals C, right? It's deeper than that. It's deeper than dualism. So I still don't know inside versus outside. And if we apply the same question to, am I an individual self, or am I unified with the universe? Am I one with the universe, or am I me, as I conventionally see? And again, it's a dualistic question, and we're not going to get an answer that falls to one side or the other. And in koan practice, all the time, when we start falling to one side of a question or another, our teacher will point us to the other side until we're not taking sides anymore. And once you truly don't know anything and don't take sides anymore, that's what it takes to be a sensei, I guess. You experience it deeply, but you experience life deeply, but the dualistic mind can't explain it much as it wants to. Seriously, though, this falling to one side or the other is what separates us from the universe. We feel so individual that we feel separate, and we feel something's lacking. And we might feel lonely, we might feel alienated, we might feel alone and threatened by the world. And yet, we're deeply a part of the world. We came from the universe. We're going back to the universe. It's a false dichotomy. Again, we can't say I'm one with the universe. We can't say I'm individual. We can't say both and we can't say neither. So this is why we often say, in describing our relationship to the universe, we often say not to, right? Because we're trying to express it in a way that doesn't fall to one side or the other. And I remember Shishin Roshi saying that at a certain point in his practice, he put up notes all over his house that said not to, if I'm remembering this correctly, to remind him of this not to-ness, to keep looking for the not to-ness. So it's important to remember, we were not born into this dualistic way of thinking. We learned dualism. We were born into a condition where we did not know the difference between us and our surroundings, or between us and our mother. This is known scientifically, right? We didn't exactly know unity because we didn't know what unity was. We didn't have any words for anything. So we didn't know separation. We didn't know unity. This is why babies are not enlightened, but they are in a condition of unity. And along with learning to think comes this way of divvying up everything into this and that, or self and other in our case. So, however, it's of value to reflect upon the fact that we once knew unity. And a lot of our sense of lack is that we grew ourselves into duality, into separation. Of course, we needed to do that to survive. We needed to grow an ego, a sense of self, all of these things. And then at a certain point in life, it starts to feel like it's not enough, right? It starts to feel like, I don't know, having a self is a little bit like having a pet that's not always very well behaved. It scratches the furniture and pees on things and doesn't do the right things at the right time. And so we seem to have this individual self, but it doesn't behave very well sometimes. In that second sutra of the Buddha, he makes the case that, a lot of us think that our conscious sense of self is me. And he makes the point that if that was the case, how come the self runs away with us? How come we can't control our own minds? How come, if it was me, wouldn't I be able to control it? Wouldn't I be able to say, I want my mind to be such and such a way? It's an interesting way to present it, especially if we take it as his first presentation of non-self or no self. This feeling, which is undeniable, that I'm here, that I exist, and that I'm not the same as the next person. If that was really could be called a self, then wouldn't it be so that we would have a bit more influence over it, right? We have some influence, but we've all had times when what we thought of as the self ran away with us. In fact, a lot of times that's what brings us to practice, doesn't it? So this dualistic view of me begins with learning to think, which means learning language. Once we start to learn the word ma, which is almost universal in all languages, some version of the ma sound. Once we can formulate the idea and name of ma or mom, it puts her over there and it puts us over here, right? And the split thus begins, which, as I say, is necessary. But then part of what we're doing in practice, a big part of what we're doing, is healing the split that we feel between ourselves and others, ourselves and the universe. If we didn't fundamentally feel this split, we couldn't go to war with the next country, because we would not be able to feel that they're other and we can do whatever we want to them. We wouldn't be able to abuse the earth because we would feel one with the earth. We wouldn't feel it as other that we can use for me. And this is the problem that we tend to all fall into. So there was a moment during a talk with Shishin Roshi was giving, where he said something that really was a turning word for me. It really opened something up. It stayed with me ever since. And it's rather simple. He said, when we're sitting in zazen, we don't know who we are. And this can sound very esoteric, but he went on to say, it's actually pretty down to earth. When we're sitting in zazen and not thinking, do we know that my name is Sean or Tetsudo, or how old I am, what language I speak, what gender I am, what country I live in, what century it is, etc., what my socioeconomic standing is, or that of my family, or what my parents do, or who my parents are, or what their names are. We don't know when we're in deep zazen. And if we accept that deep zazen is showing us something true about life, shouldn't we let ourselves deeply take this in? When we're in deep zazen, we certainly have that feeling of being present, don't we? But the feeling of being individuated into a Sean or a male or an American or whatever is not there. It's not present, right? We don't know who we are. And it's actually a great relief. It's one of the reasons that meditation is so good for stress reduction, because all our stresses come from thinking I'm me and I've got all this shit I got to do, right? And I got all this stuff I got to take care of, and it weighs upon me, and I've got all these problems, right? When we're in deep zazen, if we take that as a truth, we should really let that saturate us, that in a certain deep way, there is not a self present. So part of what the Buddha means by no self is that the self story is not true. So in deep zazen, the self story is not present, right? We've stopped thinking. So Katagiri Roshi used to say, Descartes had it pretty correct when he said, I think, therefore I am. But there's another side to it as well. When I don't think, therefore I'm not, right? So a lot of the reason that many of us don't feel comfortable at certain social gatherings, like say cocktail parties or dinner parties, is that we're expected to trot out the story of who we are, what we do for a living, who we're married to, where we live, what our house is like, do we have kids, do we not have kids, et cetera, et cetera. And there's something about it that feels false to us often. And this is why, because we inherently know that at a deep level, that's not really who we are, right? When we're in deep zazen, we could be anyone. Sometimes people say, sometimes people ask me, is it true that in Buddhism there's no soul? And I say, no, of course there's a soul in Buddhism. It's just that there's only one of them, right? No separation. There's one soul, um, which is our true nature. In our true nature, we're not separate from others. So Roshi went on to say that we don't know these things about ourselves. We don't know our state of health. We don't know our financial standing. He went on to list a number of things we don't know. And it's true, without that story of who we are, what our problems are, what our issues are, the things we have to deal with, isn't life simple? That happened to me once at Zen Mountain Monastery. It was during a retreat in July, and this is in upstate New York. And boy, does it get hot in July in upstate New York. And the monastery, I mean, they had a huge meditation hall. I don't even know how they would be able to cool it. In the summer when we do retreats at Great Mountain, it's such a relief that we've got an air conditioner because we can cool off the room. But they have a giant meditation hall there. I don't even think there'd be a way to cool off that room. So all there are some fans, and it's probably over 90 degrees and 90% humidity, and you're just sitting there sweating. And in this particular session, I had the job of being a server, and we were serving these big pots of soup. Now, I don't know why we were serving hot soup in July under these conditions, but there were these giant pots of soup, and they were hard to hold up anyway. And we're having to go in front of each person because we would do oryoki at the time, with the sitting in zazen, the ritualized way of eating with the three bowls. And the servers would go up and down the aisles, and you'd have to kneel before each person and ladle out the soup into their bowl and then stand and go to the next person. Well, by the end of this, I was just soaked with sweat. We had these students at the monastery wore these gray robes. They were all the same robe that every student wore, and mine was just soaked. And then the servers at the end of the meal, once everyone else is eating, we would go down in the dining hall and we'd sit in a row along these tables. It was the one relief that we had as a server, is we could sit at these tables. We didn't have to sit in cross-legged or zazen or kneeling position, and so that's when we all get to eat after everyone else has eaten. And I was sitting at that long table with, I don't know, 15 other servers, and all of a sudden I looked up and down the row. We're all wearing these same gray robes, all soaking wet, of course, with sweat. And all of a sudden, I could not remember who I was in any conventional way. I looked up, and it made me realize why there is this sameness of attire in Zen centers often. It might be black robes, it might be brown robes, it might be gray robes, but everybody is in more or less the same garb, right? And I looked up and down the row, and I knew I was in a monastery setting. I knew I was a practitioner of Zen. I knew that's what we were doing, but I could not recall a single thing about who I was. It's really striking. I might have been able to be in the 13th century. Who knows, you know? I'm just a person practicing Zen. I could have been anyone. So some aspect of who we think we are can drop away during zazen. And if you ever feel really uncomfortable in zazen, well, you know, that's a part of it, because sometimes we get so uncomfortable, as I did. I got so hot and so sweaty and so exhausted from hauling around the big pots of soup that, like Dogen says, the study of the self is to forget the self. I just forgot the self. You know, we just kind of want body and mind to drop off because it's so uncomfortable. So It's not necessarily a bad thing to be uncomfortable, because sometimes we get to that point where we just go, ha, drop the whole thing. And yet we're still aware, we're still present, right? Some of you have heard me speak before of this woman, Jill Bolte Taylor. I won't go into her whole story because some of you have heard it, but I really recommend seeing her TED Talk called A Stroke of Insight, My Stroke of Insight. And Jill Bolte Taylor was, she was some kind of a neuroscientist. I forget of what brand exactly, but she was a neuroscientist. She understood and had studied the mind for years. She was relatively young, I think in her late 30s or early 40s, and she had a very serious, massive stroke. And because of her training, she was able to know what was happening in a certain way from the inside. So her story is very, very interesting. When it started to happen to her, she pretty much knew right away she was having a stroke. But what happened to her is the stroke happened to only affect one side of her brain. Except left and right brain, those of you who know left and right brain theory, the left brain is said to be primarily the seat of language and logical processing. It's a little more complex than that, I believe, from my own experience. Nonetheless, there's something to it, and that's the way she explains it. Her whole left brain was shut down by the stroke, but her whole right brain was intact, with the result that despite the severe pain that she experienced during the stroke and the sense of definitely knowing she had to deal with it and the debilitating factors of it, at the same time, with only the right brain online, she was catapulted into a state that she could only call nirvana. Now, what's interesting is this is a person who had no prior involvement with anything Eastern or Buddhism or anything like that. So she's coming at it in a way completely fresh from a purely scientific observer standpoint, and yet the scientific observer standpoint is pretty precise, isn't it? It's a very conscious way of looking at certain dimensions of the universe. So she was catapulted into this nirvana state. She had no words whatsoever. In fact, it's really interesting to hear her TED Talk. There's also a book, and the book's very good too, but if you're not into brain science, just skip chapter 2 because that could set you back. She gets into the brain science in a very deep way and then goes on with her story. And probably a lot of people put down the book because it gets a little thick in the second chapter. If you should pick it up, read the first chapter and then skip the brain science one, unless you want that part of it. But she had to figure out how to dial the phone and call for help without being able to process numbers or words. And it's wonderful how she tells the story. Through a very laborious process, she manages to call one of her colleagues, and then her colleague gets on the phone and she can't speak because she has no words. So all she could do was make incoherent sounds. Fortunately, her colleague, as a neuroscientist, recognized her voice and deduced what must be going on if she couldn't speak, and got her help. Anyway, it took her some time to rehabilitate, as you can imagine. And of course, she wanted her language center back. Of course, she wanted her linear mind back. Of course, we need the linear mind. We need that side of things for the things that it's good for, even just to plan to get to the Zen Center on time. We need that part of mind that will tell us what time it is and set our alarm clock or whatever we need to do to get there. So we need that side of our mind. Nonetheless, it was quite a revelation to her because this state that she called nirvanic was a state of oneness. She felt completely at one with the universe for the first time in her life, despite the pain, despite the trouble, despite the crisis, despite the fact that she might die. And that she knew that, not verbally, but she knew it intuitively, but it didn't disturb her. She felt, okay, if I die, that's fine. I'm one with the universe. What's the problem? Right? What's the problem? If we're one with the universe, what's the problem? So So she did survive, and she went through some years of rehabilitation. And she started to get her language center back and her linear mind back. And then she had this insight that there were certain aspects of that linear mind that contained personality traits that she did not want to come back online. So, for instance, when she started being able to think verbally again, she realized that a lot of her thinking was judgmental and had to do with her superiority over other people and her impatience with people who were not as well educated or as intelligent as she was. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because she came to a certain way of practicing with her mind without thinking in terms of Buddhism. So it's kind of a fresh take on what we do. She realized if she didn't want to become this judgmental, impatient person that she had been, because her memory started to come back, and she realized, oh yeah, I've been this way, and I just accepted it as me. But it's not me. It's just certain thoughts. And so she started to work with not entertaining those thoughts, not letting them get leverage again. And she had some success in becoming a different person. Isn't that interesting? What she had thought of as herself was this judgmental, impatient, highly educated, highly intelligent person who was more intelligent, more educated, and more capable than most other people, and therefore felt superior. And she didn't want that self back. She didn't want it back. So she worked with it, and she was able to grow kind of a different self from the blank slate that she was starting with. And she was able to keep that sense of unity as well and balance it with this old part of herself that was coming back online, this ability to think and reason and think linearly. So the other insight that she had as her whole mind began to come back online, and she was rather disappointed. Some of this is from the book. It's not all in the TED Talk, but the TED Talk will give you the basics. So I highly recommend it, my stroke of insight. She started to realize as the interior monologue started back up that we all have, right? She's like, oh no, this is starting back up again. I'm not sure I want this, because once the interior monologue starts back up, I don't feel, it's harder to find that unity consciousness that she'd been living in for some time. She did find a way to balance it for herself, and who knows, she may have eventually gotten into some form of practice, or the book doesn't go that far. I don't know what happened, but she invented her own self-invented practice of not letting certain of these aspects take hold again. You could call them personality aspects. We think of them as personality aspects, but what she saw is they weren't basic. They were just a system of conditioned thoughts. I'm better than others. And thoughts linked with feelings, of course, as they always are. So the feelings of impatience and looking down on other people and feeling superior and all that, she just didn't let it come back online, and therefore she was able to keep some access to that feeling of oneness. But what insight she had as the monologue started to come back on is, oh my God, the purpose of the internal monologue is to keep telling me who I am. It's to keep telling us who we are. But as she discovered, and as we discover through zazen, that internal monologue is not who we are. That internal monologue is just a pattern of conditioned thoughts. So certainly one of the things the Buddha is talking about when he talks about the unreality of the self, when he talks about no self, is he's talking about that story of who we think we are. Now, if that was who we think we are, in zazen, we let go of thoughts again and again and return to direct experience. We wouldn't be able to let go of those thoughts if those thoughts were who we are, right? There's a bigger, deeper self that is actually the part of us that is engaged in zazen and is turning our attention away from the thoughts and back to our direct experience again and again. Our self-story is largely encoded in those thoughts. So as we as we practice letting go of these thoughts, we can take on, I would advise taking on certain aspects of the self story as being more manageable than to try and take on the whole thing. But for instance, two aspects that I've spoken of before that I took on at different times. One was pointless worry about things that would never happen. Obviously, that's self-oriented, something we all do, all humans pretty much do. We worry about things that we know cognitively are never going to happen, and or probably won't, and a good deal of the time they don't. And at the same time, we can't stop. That realization that they're not real doesn't give us the power to stop thinking them. So at a certain time, I made a really concerted effort to work with letting go of those kinds of thoughts, not just in zazen, but in daily life. That's what it takes. You have to let go of certain types of patterns of thinking 1,000 times and 1,000 times more, and that's just the first week. But I eventually got a handle on it, and the result being, I do not worry. Don't worry. Life's a lot better without pointless worries. You know, it took some training, but it wasn't part of me. I would have thought it was part of me at the time, you know, when I first noticed I was having this. And the other was negative self-talk, which is that part of us that thinks we're not good enough. It's that judgmental part that, like Joe Bolte Taylor had. Of course, hers often played out as feeling superior. But if we don't doubt our superiority, we don't have to think we're superior. So if we think we're superior, it often means we have a sense of inferiority that we're trying to build up, right? But whether superior or inferior, we all own the ground we stand on, right? We're exactly who we are, and it's okay to be exactly who we are, just like it's okay for everyone else to be exactly who they are. So all that negative self-talk that I'd come up with from childhood about not being good enough, about there being something fundamentally wrong with me. The only thing fundamentally wrong with me is called being human. You know, that was something by taking on that particular category of thought, I was able to let go of. Part of the result of both those things is I had been desperately shy up until, I don't know, certainly through my teens, childhood, teens, and 20s, I'd been desperately shy. Come to find out, once I wasn't continually judging myself and continually worrying about things, which only happened through the power of zazen, of being able to build that muscle of letting go of thoughts. Once I realized those were just thoughts and did the work of letting go of those patterns, lo and behold, I'm not shy, I'm an extrovert. How funny, what a strange thing to discover. I wasn't who I thought I was at all. So that conventional sense of who we think we are is malleable. At least it is if we take hold of it with our greater self, our greater mind. Our true nature knows that that's not who we are. And the more that we build our intimacy with our true nature through not knowing, I thought I knew who I was, this shy, withdrawn person who had something wrong with them. And well, it was wrong. It's just a pattern of thoughts. Our thoughts in a certain way are always wrong. They have levels of how right they are, how accurate they are, but they're never as accurate as what we experience when we're sitting in zazen and not thinking. Or in our life and not playing out the script of who we think we are. So anyway, I'd like to leave a few minutes for questions, discussion, and we'll continue this examination of what the Buddha could possibly mean by this. I don't want to call it a doctrine. It's an experience that he had that he wants us to have as well through the practice of not being a fixed, immutable self, of being something far greater than that. So we'll pick that up in April.